All right. So this is fifth consciousness interview at the summer school in Venice. And here I have Larissa Albantakis. Thank you for coming. And Billy Marshall. Thank you for coming. And it's a bit noisy over there with students shouting, but let's get started. So Larissa and Bill have been quite sort of central persons to push IIT, especially from 3.0. And both of you are now working on the paper for IIT 4.0, right?
Yep.
That's right.
Yeah, so the one of the high time for this IIT, the summer school, for me was this, update of, IIT 4.0 and to get to understand, what they are trying to do. So we want to talk about it definitely, but also maybe as a start, let me ask sort of how you, came to be interested in consciousness and or IIT in the first place. Maybe Larissa, yeah.
I should maybe say, so I started to work with Julio about a bit more than 10 years ago now. So I've been working in Madison for pretty much exactly 10 years. And yeah, that's quite a while. And so I came just in the preparation of 3.0. So right. Julio had just started he had published his archive paper, the 2012, where a lot of the ideas for 3.0 were
archive paper,
the Italian
Italian thing, yeah.
And so then based on that, the formalization of that had just started to be put down by Masahumi Izumi.
Yeah.
You know him, and so yeah, I did my PhD together with Gustavo Deco on computational neuroscience, and before that, I started out in physics because I wanted to learn about the universe and everything.
What kind of physics?
Just physics. I mean, my interest initially was astrophysics, but
really?
then I mean, it's a bit hilarious because I realized that most astrophysicists just work with computers. And then I did biophysics, and now I just work with computers, but it's okay. So
turning around.
Yes, but then I went to biophysics and neuroscience and basically realized that what I'm actually interested in is people and not so much galaxies. And so I did my PhD
rather than extrinsic outside, intrinsic inside.
Well, the most interesting complex system is our brain, and the most interesting question about it in the end is consciousness.
Right.
But so first I did decision making, so cognition. I was interested in system neuroscience, but when I was done with my PhD, I was also a bit done with decision making because it's always very fixed paradigms. And I read Christoph's book, the Quest for Consciousness, and I read Dennett's book, and I actually didn't know very much about Julio back then because I guess it's most famous for doing sleep research.
Right.
I knew I wanted to do theory work, and I knew I wanted to work on consciousness. And in the end, though, it was all serendipity that Gustavo Deco, my supervisor, met Julio, and then in the end, that's how I ended up in Madison.
I see. Gustavo was here for 3-4 days. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It would have been great that if he also talked about that his work on the consciousness, but he didn't have time, right? And you overlapped with Masahumi pretty much, or started the time pretty much at the same time as Masahumi?
He might have been there for a year.
Before
actually,
you.
Yes. So when he had worked out, and you wanted to talk a bit about the different courses, the past frameworks, and so the 2.0 was done by David Balduzzi, right, in 2008. And so I think what Masahumi had already done was sort of take that, implement the cause and the effect side, and so do the sort of concepts that were done. And so it was from moving there to Big Phi and figuring all that out that I appeared on the scene. So
when I asked a similar kind of question to Masahumi, he did not remember, or maybe he told me, but I don't remember, or something like that. Okay, great. And then Bill?
So I also didn't really know much about consciousness or IIT when I came to Madison. I came
when was it?
in 2014.
14.
I came, and so 3.0 had just come and been out for months maybe when I came. And my background is in statistics, and I've been working on information theory measures and causal measures, applied to neuroscience like EEG, recording type things, functional connectivity, effective connectivity, and
So you are working on the neural data before?
Yeah,
okay.
Kind of applied statistics
I
background.
see.
And I knew of Julia just from the neural complexity paper, and I mean, I know that kind of has a lot of underlying stuff about IIT in it. But the paper itself doesn't mention it, and so I didn't know he studied consciousness.
So is that the paper that Marcello was talking today, like the complexity and the consciousness in '98, or
there's
even
a very
before?
close one. It's very similar, came out around the same time, but it's in PNAS, and it's just about neural complexity.
Yes. Yeah, that's sum or mean of the mutual information of all the
mutual information of the whole minus the parts, the pairwise pieces.
Right.
And so I saw a job posting where he was looking for somebody who does causation and information theory to basically help develop the mathematical part of theory a bit more. And so I applied, and he sent me the 3.0 paper and said, read this and let me know if you want to come. And I read it, and I was intrigued by it. I'd never even considered consciousness as like something I would study before.
Usually nobody knows how to do statistics or theory on it, right? Yeah.
And so I mean, at the very beginning, I wouldn't say I really understood it the first pass, but it was intriguing. And I wanted to learn more. And so I came, and then I stayed for still working with him. So
yeah. When did it come to kind of click or sort of realization that this might actually make sense kind of feeling? Like I wanted to touch upon with this walking, talking tradition in Julio's lab, right? Do you still walk a lot with him for a long time and then
sometimes
discuss?
Very sometimes.
Sometimes.
But
more talking, less walking now.
Because now the lab shrank a bit with the pandemic. People moved back to their countries.
Right.
But it actually grew. I mean, when I arrived, it was just Mazumi and Eric Coel and me, and then in between we had as much as like 8, 9, 10 people that were not all directly working on the theory. Some were also doing experimental tests and all, but with interest in the discussions, and so then you don't go around talking to a group of 10 people really. But yeah, I think like with some of the free will discussions we really had a full house, like 18 people possibly.
You asked about when it clicks, and it comes in waves. There's not one moment, but there's kind of like often you'll hear, or for me at least, there's a turn of phrase that Julia will say quite often, and the first maybe 5 or 6 times you hear it doesn't quite click, and then something will happen, some example or something will come together, and you get kind of, and then that will kind of seal together a big chunk of this, all these moving pieces. But then you think you've got it, and then a couple days later you realize, you're still missing something. It comes in waves. Yeah, there are many kind of pieces or sort of steps that is tricky in at the beginning, right? Like I also remember why do we need to, for example, partition the system, or the difference between the causal intervention versus observation, or composition, and how do you get the small phi from small combinations of things, and then why does it differ from the big things and so on. For me, why doing this kind of analysis by myself was really helpful. It's like mathematics, right? In a sense, even though if you don't understand it at the first pass, and if you read the same thing twice or 3 times, then you start to understand the beginning after knowing the last part, kind of thing. Yeah, and by doing too, right? Like You can't do the whole thing by hand, but you can take chunks of it and kind of work it out on pen and paper.
Right.
That, I mean, that's kind of how I learn, and that really helped me when I was first coming through.
I see.
Also fair to say that if you want to contribute to the lab and all, like you arrive there, it's not like, you know, you spend time to figure everything out before you start working. You have to sort of accept things a little bit to get started and do things, and you might not understand why you do it exactly in the way that you know we do it. And then with time, you know, have one realization after the other. And even, you know, even like 9 years in, I, you know, had some recollection where it was like, oh, I never really got this, but now, so because also there are so many things that get encoded into these phrases, you know, like, I mean, even starting from the axioms, when you the experience is the way it is, right? So you're like, oh, okay, sure, the experience is the way it is, but you know, to for that not just to be this tautology that is almost meaningless. Like you have to let that sit for a while, or things like we start from phenomenology, you know. I mean, we say that in every single paper, and we start from, but it becomes the sentence, you know, and that so much is based on that and implied by that, and there's so many implications. It's easy to run past that and then forget about it once you're at the end, and once you measure things like the PCI or something.
Yeah, people always want to get the easy answer to the question that they have, right? So yeah, unless, you know, somebody is really interested in, you know, answering or addressing the question of consciousness, it's hard to keep the motivation to, you know, get the interest in, you know, reading all these IIT papers, and so trying to understand each parts, you know, properly. It takes time, really. Yeah, as any research, but in particular IIT, right? I would say. Some of the probably audience are probably interested in working on IIT on the both theory side or empirical testing side, or just for interest in understanding. But do you have any kind of, you know, recommendation where to start or how to, you know, resolve these kind of questions when it hits?
Well, please send us emails, please. Don't spend forever and get wrong conclusions. And I'm always happy if someone's interested and they actually ask, you know, because too many papers get written where people completely misinterpret IIT and then they want to write about it, and it's just, there was this initial misunderstanding that could have been resolved by just talking to us, and people don't talk to us. So please, we are nice. We will reply, you know.
I think that's probably the most important moment of this video, probably. I'd emphasize it. And yeah, Hagrid, yeah.
Yeah, and especially if your interest lies kind of in the beginning of the theory, like the, you know, start from phenomenology, you go from axioms, and you go postulates, the math, you know, building it up. I think if you were instead saying, well, I want to start from, you know, take it, all that is given and work on the mathematical framework and say, I think I could say this more concisely, or, you know, you wanted to develop a heuristic measure, there, I think, you know, you have, if you software that comes from the lab available as like a check on what you do to make sure you understand things. There, I think, is a place where it's easier to kind of jump in, but it's very hard to contribute to this kind of foundational aspects without kind of communicating with the lab and making sure there are miscommunications.
Yeah, I also often ask a question to you guys, or, you know, my student, when my student asks some question that I'm not really sure, then, you know, I forward the question to you guys, right? And then I get the answer, usually immediately. So that's good. Okay, and so the about the current project, or maybe, you know, about the IIT 4.0. So it's the part of the update has been already released in part of the papers
yes.
previously, right?
Yeah, the kind of the plan
Mm.
is really, it's such a kind of monster to kind of work with, but we tried to break it down into chunks. So there's, the relations,
That's
space paper and
introduced
story.
in Andrew Horn and Tonori entropy. Yep.
And then there's the mechanism integrated information and intrinsic difference about how the specific measure we use.
Right. That's a Barbosa's 2 papers.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then there's still the kind of big phi needs to be updated to kind of become in line with all of the other changes and kind of seal all of these pieces together. And
that part is not published, right?
no, it's in progress. It's close.
Yes.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And then once we have all these modules, the 4.0 should ideally just be kind of
a wrapper,
putting them all together, being able to point to them, and maybe some observations about how the whole thing now.
Yeah, and I think one important, so what the 4.0 will try to show is how much effort we put in to make the 3 parts, the distinctions, the relations, and the big phi sort of consistent, formally consistent, and consistent with the axioms. So we really try to emphasize that at every level, the same principles apply. And yes, so.
Yeah, so Marcello and also Marco, who is doing demo right now at the, over there, TMSEG demo, they were really pleased the version of the presentation, Julio gave this time, because one axiom and then one postulate, and you kind of introduced the corresponding concept in an orderly manner, right? Previously, it seems like it was very difficult to find a point for people who are not that familiar with. So the presentation of the theory also probably improved quite a bit, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think it makes sense because in some ways, as Julio will tell you, basically everything was already there at the very beginning. Even so, even though it's called integrated information theory, and you didn't have the 5 axioms listed in 2004 or something. If you actually go and read through the paper, you will find mention of almost everything, like even exclusion and everything is in there. But so the 3.0 was the first one to make everything explicit.
Right.
And so, of course, that wasn't necessarily all perfect for in terms of exposition, and so we got a lot of feedback on how people misunderstood or didn't really. There was this whole paper, it's in Bain's paper, in Bain's paper on the axioms of thought, and that really helped to or what we try to do with reformalizing, restating the axioms and postulates. Not like the meaning changed for us very much, but the expression changed to avoid misunderstandings, mostly in the direction of they're actually much more basic principles than they have been interpreted as.
Yeah, and on this topic of communication, right, there's also these various levels. You think of who are the intended audience, and with IIT, it's one of the theories of consciousness gets a lot more attention from philosophers. So philosophers have a lot to kind of interpret or think about on the kind of the axiom side, but then it's one of the more mathematical frameworks. And when you've got mathematicians who want to contribute, they want to see, that the notation is kind of coherent and makes sense to what they're doing.
Right.
And then you also want it to appeal to, neuroscientists who do experimental work, who aren't like either of those 2 previous groups, because you want, them to, do their work and use IIT as like a way to guide or interpret some of their findings. And so there are lots of different people you're trying to communicate with. It's a challenge.
I don't want to use a metaphor of the fight, but typically the best strategy for the war or something like that is to focus on only one side, right? And then not to the double-sided kind of right.
No,
but it's necessarily
in a way,
the case.
that's the feedback we also got on the 3.0. In many ways, a lot of people weren't happy with it because it was, maybe not as rigorous as it could have been in formalizing everything, because we basically went through the math by means of examples and didn't just write down the algorithm sort of. And on the other hand, there were equations, right? So people were going, that aren't used to math.
That they skipped that part.
Skipped it. Yes. So I mean, the 4.0, I guess we were really trying to have just all the formal things in one place. So we're probably not trying to please neuroscientists with that paper, but have it as a formal account. It's rigorous, and hopefully, I mean, we did put a lot of work to make it consistent, coherent.
So it's more like a mathematically oriented.
It's yes, the paper itself for sure, and I think we also try to address all the from philosophy the criticism, and which has to do with the math to some like, you know, if it's a measure of consciousness, it should be a unique measure or something like that. That's almost a philosophical point.
Right.
Important thing.
I see. Some people like Larissa was, I don't know whether he's caricaturing or seriously, you know, raising this problem, but from outsiders, when it would converge is unclear. So if they are even interested, you know, they are not really sure whether this is the time that I should spend, you know, lots of time to understand, or whether it's going to be expected upgrade in another year or two or 10 years. What would be your expectation or
I think you should maybe think of them like Game of Thrones books. Longer and longer between successive releases.
I see. 2004, 2008, that's the second one. And then 6 years after that.
Now it's 8
and then
years.
now 8 years.
So 10 years.
So 10 years or 12 years.
10 years. Yeah, I mean, that's probably a pretty accurate prediction. On the other hand, I think what we should say is that already, you know, with the 3.0, there were some I mean, not things we knew were wrong, but things we knew were condensed that now have been made explicit. So in as we also want to say with the papers, it's the first account that is complete in terms of describing sort of everything that's part of phenomenology, right? So it might not be the perfectly right way to do everything, but everything's included.
I see.
I would also hope to say, when you're thinking about convergence, the size of the steps should get smaller each time. And I think,
yeah, there was a huge jump from 1 to 2, and 2 to 3 was also big.
Yeah, so we were
less probably.
1 to 3 is definitely in this initial transient, and I think, you know, comparing 2 to 3 and then 3 to 4, it's much smaller of a jump. It's much more.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like 3.0 is contained in 4.0 almost.
Yeah.
So I think that'll continue. I think you're going to see major paradigm shifts.
Yeah, so then I don't know whether this may be a bit too specific for the audience, but the biggest interest for me about, you know, 4.0 upgrade is you know, relations and other associated kind of concepts, and as a consequence, the sort of phenomenological prediction, in a sense, that was made in IIT 2.0 with Balducci Qualia paper, was that the nature of the one particular sense, Qualia, like a color or audition, strongly depends on how that relates to other sense. But as far as I understood, you know, 4.0, it's probably more to do with the intrinsic connectivity that should predict the type of the phenomenology. More so than at least, you know, 2.0, right?
Yes, but kind of the one way to think of the quality, quality of the experience is, you kind of say it's the structure. So it's not an aspect of it, but it's the whole structure. But what ends up defining that structure are these new to 4.0 objects called relations. And they capture a lot of, what you're saying, right? The structure comes from how the distinctions are related. And
Right.
So in some sense, I think, without being kind of rigorous or technical, there is a way in which, what something means being related to everything else is going to be captured by, because the structure is defined by how this distinction relates to all the other ones, and that's going to come through. I think it's still kind of, it's a little bit morphed. It's been modified just slightly in terms of exactly how it's expressed, but the core
I see. Okay. And then maybe, in the interest of time, so you, what's your sort of next step after publishing 4.0? There's probably loads of, backlog of things that you wanted to do.
Yes,
Yeah.
maybe. I mean, the most direct ones are that we have two papers, not really empirical, I should say, but that try to estimate approximations of the 4.0 measure in different sizes of networks. So there's one that is a numerical approximation applied to networks of about 1,000 neurons.
I see.
Simulated networks, and so we're trying to do sort of approximation.
So that's kind of addressing some kind of request from many people that, okay, so this is never computable, so there's no point, but now you're trying to address at least a proxy.
And obviously it's still the rigorous formula is still incomputable. There's no question about that. But yes, so we have approximation of various steps, and then others are resolved by sampling. So it won't be, that you can take a particular network and the same network with a little change and compare them. But what we can do is take, different types of architectures at the large scale and see, if how the phi value grows with the number of neurons in the complex or other things like that. So that's a paper that is obviously depending on 4.0 to be complete, but will hopefully be out soon after. And then we do the same thing on an even larger scale analytically. So there's another paper that hopefully will, I think, would give it to the end of the year maybe, that tries to approximate based on just properties of the connections.
I'll say, when you say analytically, these are kind of more like asymptotic results. So let the network grow kind of indefinitely large, and then you can have some kind of asymptotic results about how some of these functions behave. As, do they exponentially, linearly, or whatever. The work is kind of less precise, but more in that kind of vein.
That's kind of related to the questions that were raised during today's multi-channels lecture, in a sense, to me. So how does it also relate to how does the PCI or this stimulation and the response kind of paradigm relate to IIT's prediction? Is some of the analytical approximation or sort of network structure to prediction of IIT relate to this direction, linking how to apply that in a some of the practical measure of the level of consciousness or context of consciousness?
There was definitely work along those lines, let's say a year or to a year and a half ago, and I haven't gotten a status update on that in a while. I mean, in some sense, those projects kind of got put on hold because you don't want to publish them and have them be basically dead on arrival, and you change the theory immediately. But that's definitely on the radar. So one of the other projects, or one way to describe 4.0 is trying to take everything and kind of tighten how it's related to the postulates and axioms. One place we haven't done that for the 4.0 kind of publication is the whole kind of offshoot of the theory that is the macro-micro story with macro levels, and you look across spatial temporal grains.
Your paper,
which I published on
box,
before, and Larissa and Eric well. And so one thing that needs to be done, and we've already thought a lot about it, but it's kind of, we're not going to wait till it's done, is to kind of revisit that story, but again, trying to anchor things to the postulates in a more rigorous way as we define the process of going across grains and making sure that we're being, because we've always had little aspects of the postulates kind of here and there that we think about when we made the initial decisions, and we should kind of revisit that and then also like kind of confirm or deny or whatever the result is. You know, can we replicate these causal emergence results using new measures? So that'll need to be done.
Yeah, maybe a good way with the micro, the coarse graining part. We had the first paper in 2013 with Eric Wells, the first author, that was just doing effective information.
Right.
So it didn't have even integration.
Right.
It was just a matter of demonstrating that the causal constraints measured in informational terms could actually increase, which is something that is a surprising result, right? And then the 2016 macro paper took that and actually did the 3.0 version of that, right? And so all that still holds, but I think now there will be further constraints even on how a system has to be structured to allow for a hierarchical sort of emergence of you know, you can be composed of there's the molecules, your neurons, your network, a much more macro version of the network, and all these reasonable systems that seem integrated in their own rights, like cells, for example, right? But there's one maximum, one absolute maximum, and that would correspond to consciousness. But what we're planning to do is a bit more in that vein, that we can also sort of have integrated components. Yes.
I see.
So as a, just to follow up that in the black boxing paper, which was the third in that kind of series, you take microelements, you group them together and call them something, you call them a macro element. And we kind of, in our exploration of examples, we were looking at kind of, you say, well, how do you do this? Well, you kind of choose all possible ways you could group them together and find one that maximizes. But there are some kind of fringe cases where you end up taking things that have no business being together, like you know, one of your neurons and one of my neurons, and you group them together. And you say that they're one thing. You're kind of, and the elements themselves end up being not integrated. And we realize that this is kind of a problem. And so it's kind of almost parenthetical in that paper, because we weren't ready to kind of fully revisit the whole process, but we say, okay, well, things have to be integrated within. Kind of, we figured out a way to modify how you do the actual calculation to basically ensure things are integrated, that elements kind of hang together properly. And so we want to kind of formalize that properly and make sure, you know, intrinsicality and exclusion and everything is kind of sad, that we're not doing anything that should go against the postulates.
I see.
And then, of course, there's the computer consciousness paper.
Oh,
the
yeah.
long-awaited computer consciousness paper. Yes.
What's the name of that first author?
Graham
Graham
Findlay. Yeah.
Findlay. Yeah. It's been there for a really long time, right?
Yes.
It's just been sitting.
And it's not on Graham that it's sitting around.
Oh, really?
No, because it was ready. It was ready.
Of course,
Ready. But then, you know, 4.0 seemed around the corner, and we didn't want, or we, like Julio, I'm going to put the blame there, didn't want to publish it and make it obsolete in like the next year, just because then the updated version would come out and we would have to like basically also write an update on the computer consciousness paper. But then of course everything took a whole lot longer.
But the conclusion would be probably pretty much same, right?
That's exactly why we shouldn't have waited. But yes.
Yeah, so that's another thing, right? Like because so 4.0 eventually will be quite similar to 3.0, except for some of the implication about the relations, probably.
Yes.
Where's the sort of huge divergence?
Yeah, so there's still some of the same conclusions. For example, which architectures are good substrates and which
like
architectures
front,
are
back, kind of
more
stuff,
like, you know, maybe modular versus homogeneous systems
Oh.
versus complex
I see.
systems, and the complex systems will have the highest
Highest
capacity
one,
per
yeah.
phi.
Yeah.
But there's additional features of the system that now play a much bigger role than before. One of them, for example, is internal congruence. So if you have, it's not just for 3.0, all you needed was a lot of mechanisms at every order. Right. Now it's not just, so it's good to have a lot of mechanisms. So far it's the same, but then there's a difference whether all these mechanisms specify congruent causes and effects or incongruent causes and effects, right? And if the system sort of agrees on where it came from and where it's going across all orders, that will I'm sorry, that will give you a much better chance for high phi than if they're incongruent. So that might mean, for example, that linear systems are more typically congruent, whereas nonlinear system might have a lot of higher ordered mechanisms, but they can have higher ordered mechanisms that are not congruent. So that could make a difference.
Yeah, that part of the talk, because on that day specifically, I had to work on some particular grant, so I missed part of the discussion. Are you going to talk about that internal congruence kind of stuff tomorrow?
We're a little bit going to let the participants drive what they want to hear about. But if you want to hear about it, then make sure you vote.
Yeah. But that would be probably quite a bit of the minority, I guess. Yeah.
You never know, but
casual conversations, I've heard lots of people, relatively more than I've heard of other things, say that they'd be interested in seeing kind of the
more
technical
of the
details.
4.0.
Yeah, well, and technical details.
Right.
But then, of course, I'm not going to present old technical details. I present new technical details. So that's on the table.
Okay.
Should say for those that are interested to see a presentation on that, it will be coming because we are going to have we are going to have a tutorial at ASSC, and we're also going to have a tutorial at the Models of Consciousness conference.
In
and
Stanford?
Yes, and that's so we're not
September.
Yes, so we're not going. I mean, I'm not going at least for you, but
I am not sure.
Okay, so not in person, but the first they have this day of tutorial stuff that is just gonna be streamed and will be publicly available, and so there will be a tutorial by September.
I see. Great. All right. Is there anything that I forgot to ask, or is there something that like in terms of future, or maybe more sort of informal thing? If you still have time, is that right? Like if there's any kind of message for those people who are thinking of coming to Madison to do the project, or maybe another direction that we didn't discuss was that way to kind of make the IIT testable with respect to the phenomenology. That's actually what I'm actually interested in. Whether it's possible to do it, or it's still like there's a huge step that we need to take, or direct test of the sort of the different version of IIT, which one explains or fits with our experience. I don't know. So it's kind of difficult to always talk about this test of IIT, especially when you come to phenomenology side, right?
I think in terms of testing, what's probably most accessible is the ones about the boundaries of the complex and the spatial temporal grain, because it's much more feasible to get an approximation of phi than it is to kind of approximate the whole structure. Right?
Okay, so can you elaborate a little bit about sort of phenomenology side of the boundary of consciousness? Is it a sort of distinction between conscious versus unconscious kind of a processing?
So the prediction would be that what the physical substrate is a maximally irreducible cause effect structure. That's definite, meaning it's a specific set of elements and with a specific grain, definite grain, I should say, definite temporal grain and spatial grain. And so the prediction, I mean, from the empirical evidence, clearly it has to be in the brain.
Right.
But also, if we talk about temporal scale, there's obvious scales that are too slow and that are too fast.
Right.
Spatial scales that are obviously wrong, like in terms of what we're able to accomplish. And so if we can approximate phi across some different grains and some different brain regions, and kind of making sure that those things match up with what we know from the empirical work about what regions of the brain matter for consciousness or not. For example, the cerebellum is a popular choice to say.
Right.
It doesn't seem to, based on the report and based on what it does. So if we found the maximum there, that would kind of be a falsification. But if we find it somewhere that seems to really matter for consciousness, then that would be.
But that sounds like though the test of IIT between the brain and IIT kind of.
It's actually in many ways the best test between versions, because like there are a lot of decisions that went into having the formalism exactly the way it is, and they some of them might not matter that much for the experimental predictions, but others actually do matter quite a lot for the possible size of the system given its underlying architecture. And so in a way it's a bit concerning that some of the choices we had to make, the empirical prediction would be very sensitive to it, but on the other hand it's good because we can actually go in and it will make a difference and we can see if we're completely wrong or
right
not,
that makes falsifiable.
Yeah, a little bit more directly specific to even what decisions we made for the formalism.
Yeah as long as the sort of the theory is general kind of prediction and conclusion remains the same, some kind of small details like what you are talking as a sort of choice of the things that doesn't really matter much, right? I guess. I mean, it's a sort of a matter of the improvement.
It's I mean, to give a very, very technical example, but there's a question. So we have introduced this notion of a compositional state.
Right.
And it means that every subset of the system should only be specified by one distinction. Now, I mean, Julio feels really good about that and everything, but it means that a lot of the distinctions that the system could have in a normal system are not going to be counted. And so that means that it's the relative phi value is on average quite a bit lower than if you were allowed to keep all the distinctions as in 3.0, right? So, and that difference might pretty dramatically change the where we would locate the border. And so that, at least in that, I mean, not every choice is like sensitive like that, but there are some.
I should say what kind of, there's another change that kind of interacts with what Larissa was saying, I think is important here. So in the intrinsic information paper by Leo,
Barbosa.
Barbosa, we have this measure that we're using, basically a distance between probability distributions.
Right.
It's been a common thing. So, well, which one's the right one?
Right.
And so, this paper says, well, now if you're measuring things from the intrinsic perspective, here's how we think it has to be done. And they were able to show that, given these properties, you get this measure.
Right. Right.
Unique, with properties argued from an intrinsic perspective.
Yeah.
But a feature of that measure is it's a trade-off between what we call expansion and dilution.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the talk. Yeah.
Basically, and where that plays out the most is in terms of, let's say we're talking about a distinction, a mechanism, and we're choosing its purview. And so what expansion means is when you, in dilution, so you add a new element to the purview, just a potential element. And the more, if you don't kind of constrain it, you don't say its future state with high probability, then you dilute it because you're kind of uncertain about what the future is going to be. But then you also kind of gain, use information colloquially here. You gain information about the state of that unit. And so the question is, does you have a trade-off? How much do you lose because you're not as specific versus how much information in the kind of colloquial sense did you gain from having it? And so you have a trade-off between expansion and dilution. And that has implications for how big the purview grows. You grow into a certain point and then you stop. And the same for the system as a whole. When you're trying to maximize big phi, it's a trade-off between expansion and dilution. It grows to a certain point and stops. And so combine that with this question about which distinctions count, and then you grow to different sizes, and that will impact,
I see.
So the prediction that the maximum of phi should be the seat of consciousness, that doesn't change. But when we try and apply it to the brain, what we find in the brain, I think the location will probably end up being the same, but the size of what we find is slightly dependent on this decision.
I see.
And to come back to the content that you mentioned, the space story is published by Andrew Hown and Giulio, and there has already been some experimental tests, like in the psychophysics paper is out by Chen Song, and that same experiment, I think the same, I'm not exactly sure, but they're doing an fMRI version of that where they're also trying to establish what we thought was underlying the changes. So, really happened the way we were thinking. And then the theory group is certainly going to move or put a lot of effort into figuring out other substrates for content. So there's already someone working on time, what it means to have the temporal flow and experience of temporal flow. So what would it mean to have a little melody in your experience or something like that. And also Matteo Grasso, he's working on objects and invariants. So we have space, but then how come that I can see something as a segment no matter where it is or something, or what does it mean to be able to abstract certain things. So have it's this particular thing no matter where it is located. And so that's the next, and then from there we move further. But it's certainly, the content is important, I think, because the content highlights really what is unique about IIT, that it can address these things, it wants to address these things, and there can be specific predictions that follow. Very nice even, about anatomical properties of the brain, because one implication of time is that we associate a certain substrate with the experience of time, of a temporal extendedness. And so given that we have that experience, we should be able to go into the brain and find that kind of architecture, and it's not exactly known if that exists right now.
Yeah, I probably will need to read and then think about these part of the details, I guess. Maybe it's like 50, so maybe should we
wrap up soon?
Yeah, maybe at some point I wanted to ask about the exclusion action or quantum version of the things, and also quantum cognition, but maybe that's next time.
Maybe next time. Yes, I'm happy to do that, maybe after the paper comes out. So I am working on a quantum IIT paper that sort of don't want to oversell it in a way. All that it is the mechanism integrated information translated into a quantum mechanical formalism.
But for that, just one clarification is that the axiom stays the same.
Everything stays the same. So we're trying to do it really just, you take a system of interacting qubits, and if the qubits are classical, you should get the exact same result as you get.
But then I might want to ask then, just briefly, but the exclusion axiom doesn't sound like really compatible with the quantum view, no?
That's right. What we should find in the end is that if you have you don't want very high phi for quantum systems, because you want your highest phi's to be at the level of neurons. So, and I should say, because we talked, it's important to say, nothing of, quantum IIT implies in any way that our interactions between neurons depend on quantum effects.
Yeah, that's fine.
So
totally
the
fine.
motivation to do it is more of a motivation that because of exclusion, IIT does not presuppose that consciousness happens at the particular spatial temporal scale. Then I think Adam Barrett had a paper that was criticizing the formalism specifically for not being applicable across all sorts of physical systems.
Right.
And in a way, it's a patch of that to say, look, maybe you cannot apply it to all possible systems, like you might not be able to apply it to continuous systems directly, but you can actually extend it to our current best idea of microphysics, which is quantum mechanics. So that's the purpose.
I see. Yeah, that part I still want to delve into, but maybe it's time for you to go. Otherwise, you miss that boat. So
I should go.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
All right, thanks for having us.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I hope that this will inspire some people to wait for further tutorial in ASSC and also Stanford.
Yep.
Yeah,
That's right.
that's great. Thank you very much. All right, that's it.
You don't have like a sign off you do?